So, first week of February, start of a new, what we call the church year, because January we slow down a bit. So who's excited and full of hope for 2022? Who's not sure? It's a little bit like that, isn't it? After 2 years of COVID disruptions, of lockdowns, of cancellations, of changes, of constant adaptations, it can be a little bit harder to find yourself getting too excited for the future. There has actually been some research done that talks a little bit about the way that COVID is impacting or affecting the way that we think, the way that we hope, the way that we plan, the way that we look forward. It's interesting that it even affects, as I said, the way that we hope, the way that we hope. Here's an example. Who's got a holiday coming up? Are you excited about it? I don't know, there's been some stuff that says that holidays pre-COVID had a great effect on our psyche. It's not just the holidays, it was the planning, it was the booking, it was the anticipation of the holiday coming that was almost just as good as the holiday itself. That we would spend all this time really looking forward to just about to get away, and then we'd go on the holiday and then we'd enjoy that as well. But since COVID, they found that we've lost that first part of it. That we don't anticipate as much. Why? Because it's been cancelled so much in the past. You know, the last 2 years we sort of got excited about holiday and it hasn't happened. Mara and I discovered that this year, going up to Queensland. You know, we've been trying 3 different times, and it's a bit like going, well, we'll see, we'll get excited when we get there, It sort of has taken all that other stuff away. And so it's like there's this fine line between discouragement and hope. And we sort of are walking that fine line at the moment. So at the start of the beginning of a new year, do we allow ourselves to get excited for this year? About all the things that we hope that might happen this year? Or are we tempering that excitement a little bit? Just because of the experience of the last 2 years going, well, if it happens, I'll get excited then. It's a little bit tricky because next week we get to do Vision Sunday. The brochure is already being prepared. Kevin and I have already done some work. We've been talking with the executive. It goes to church council this week. You know, next week we get to cast it from the front here, which is normally a time that we get very excited about what God is doing with us as a church and moving forward. And I'm a little wondering how the effects of the last 2 years is going to impact upon something like Vision Sunday. Are we ready to hope for what God might do in our church over the next 12 months? Our Bible reading today comes from, the first one comes from the book of Exodus. And I've got to give credit to Kevin for this one. It's really good working as a team. You know, we were talking about some ideas for ministry, bouncing stuff off together, allowing our thoughts to enrich each other. And I was sharing with Kevin the idea of my sermon. He came back with this passage. I went, oh, that's really good. Can I nick that? So thank you, Kevin, for not only coming up with the idea, but allowing me to nick it. So this reading from Exodus 15 comes, as David pointed out, just after the miracle of the Red Sea. It is actually directly after. It's like it's the next verse. They travel through the Red Sea, and then we have the passage at the beginning of Exodus 15, which is Moses and Miriam singing, you know, I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Yeah, you know it. And if you don't know it, you've had a different upbringing than I've had. You're going to have that song stuck in your head now, aren't you? Yeah, so they've just sung this huge song of praise, and then this story comes directly after it. The very next verse, They head out into the desert, and 3 days later, they start grumbling and complaining because there is no water, and when they find water, the water is bitter. Wow, 3 days after one of the biggest miracles in the Old Testament of God rescuing them and bringing them freedom, 3 days later, they're complaining and grumbling that the water is bitter. It's a fine line between hope and discouragement, isn't it? Between this huge celebration of what God is doing and then being discouraged because of what the current situation is. I don't want to be too critical of the Israelites because I think that we all experience these swings between hope and discouragement. We might want to say that they should have remembered how God saved them, that they should have remembered, God's power and that God would come through for them. But we know from experience it doesn't take much ourselves to swing in between that fine line between hope and discouragement, does it? And I think it's a little bit of what we're experiencing at the moment with this COVID roller coaster that we've been on. There has been points in the last 2 years that we think we've turned the corner. We have got past this, when the initial outbreak got back to 0 cases per day, or when we got the vaccine, or when the vaccine rates got up to a certain point, or when we reopened for the first time, or the second time, or the third time. We think, this is it. But then we have those moments, in those moments when things are looking good, we feel a bit like Moses and Miriam and start praising God and going, thank you, we're beyond this. But then the pendulum swings and another variant comes along, or we get banned from singing in church yet again. And this wave of discouragement washes over us and we start to feel our hope being squashed again. Even worse, we're just a little bit more skeptical about hoping too much next time. Why plan for things if there's a chance that they'll just be cancelled again? Why commit when things are a bit uncertain? If we don't hope, we won't be disappointed. So it's probably better not to hope. Is this ringing true for anybody? Is this the experience that you're living at the moment? As I said, if that is your experience, we've got to stand up here next week and do Vision Sunday. How do we do Vision Sunday in this context? Because we want you to hope. We want you to get excited. And yet this is the reality of what we're sitting in. The 2 Corinthians chapter 4 reading that we had acknowledges this roller coaster between hope and discouragement. I didn't know that royal we comment, David. I'll have to do some more reading on that one because I'm going to refer to it that it was about us. So using the Bible and the Bible speaking to us, I do like how the Bible reading does talk a little bit about how we're a little bit fragile sometimes, a bit like, the clay jars, that we might feel that we're fragile, but Paul wants to remind us that we have access through our faith in Jesus and the community of believers to this all-surpassing power of God, he says. And so while we might experience these oscillations and discouragement, he says we might be pressed in from every side, but we're not crushed. We might be perplexed, but we're not in despair. We might have our backs up against the wall, but we can keep going. Our faith means that we can still find hope. Feel hope, because there's a fine line between that hope and discouragement. And our faith actually will help us oscillate more to the hope side. Let me see if I can play this idea of this fine line out a little bit more. I did some reading over the holidays, and one of the things I was reading was talking about the lasting impacts of COVID on the church. That COVID didn't just affect the church now, our experience of COVID, it will continue to impact upon us as we move forward. And so, these impacts might be able to be seen as negative, something that we don't like about the way that COVID has impacted upon us. But the article also said that some of these effects also open doors of opportunity. They can be something that we can find hope in. And so the article was sort of saying, when we look at the impacts, it's this fine line between seeing it as something which is bad and something which is good. And actually we could probably see it as a bit of both. So I wanted just to share, just for a few minutes, some of these reflections that I was reading about during my holidays, about being real and honest about the challenges ahead for us, but also getting a glimpse of the things that we might be able to hold on to find hope in as we move forward. Would this be helpful? Yeah? I got one nod, so that's good enough for me. So here are 3.5 ways that COVID has impacted and affected the church. The article is actually 12, but I've summarised it down to 3.5. So the first one, it has sped up the demise of the old church model. The way that we've been doing church has been changing for a while, and COVID has just brought that forward. Some churches have been struggling for a while, basically saying, we're not quite sure where our future is. What COVID has done is actually brought that forward for them, and I was reading some, possibly discouraging statistics that, up to 10% of churches may not be able to survive the impacts of COVID and won't exist moving forward. That's huge. That's huge. But certainly the old ways of doing it have been changing. And that's hard because the model that we've been used to was a very, very successful model post-World War II. For about 50 years, this model smashed it. It was really, really good. But at some point, we're discovering that it's starting to not be as helpful in the changing environment we live in. And so churches have been adapting to embrace new forms of worship or engagement or ways of serving. COVID's just sped that up incredibly. Of what we were thinking, we've probably got about another 15 to 20 years before we hit the edge. We're suddenly going, no, we're probably at the edge now. It's just sped up that process. And this has brought a number of issues to deal with, a change in our understanding of leadership. This new model has moved the power from, the ordained to the people. Pastors are finding that we're not quite the CEO who gets to tell the church what to do anymore, but we're rather becoming the coach who works beside the people to encourage and to equip while the church does the leadership. There's a change in our understanding of volunteerism and serving. And while some people are looking at this and going, that's discouraging that this is changing because the old model works so well. Other people are going, there is a sign of hope in all of this. A sign of hope which says that we can actually try new and different things and see how they go. A second way that COVID has impacted the church is that church life has had to innovate beyond the weekend services and beyond the geographical boundaries. If you look at businesses in COVID, businesses had to adapt. You had restaurants who was never interested in doing anything remotely like takeaway, having to do takeaway, and now that their in-person restaurants have come back, are continuing to do takeaway because they've discovered that there is a whole other market out there that they never tapped into because they were never aware of it or they were never interested in it. Hairdressers have been selling DIY hair colouring kits during COVID and are continuing to do that because it actually meets some people's needs. Businesses who see themselves more than just what their core function was now. They're discovering that there's other things that they can be involved in. And churches have had to do the same. That we might say that Sunday worship is our core function, but we're suddenly discovering actually church is way much more than that. And we need to be aware and adapting to those different ways of doing things. And this is not just saying we need to be continuing with online worship, which I'll come to in a moment. This is about embracing ideas and ways that people can explore faith and community and find support which have little or no connection with Sunday worship. And like some people might go, oh, no, don't say that, because we need people to come along to Sunday worship. And the reality is that maybe we need to also be understanding there's other ways of doing things. We need to be innovative. And a lot of that innovation might have to happen outside the place of Sunday or even outside the place of this building. Kevin's been talking about that for the last 3 weeks. Once again, you might find those statements incredibly hopeful or a little discouraging. But there's a fine line between the two. There's a fine line between the two. Third thing that this article raised was hybrid church will simply be church. This model of both doing online and in person is here to stay. It's not going away. And even though we already made the commitment that it's not going away, it really is not going away. This will be like this from now on. Do you see that as hopeful or discouraging? There's been an interesting debate online over the last month, if you're in the right Twitter circles, about a key leader in the church in America, a well-known leader, suggesting that churches need to stop their online offerings, because if we continue to offer online offerings, people won't come back in the building. So we need to just stop it and people will come back. And there's been this huge discussion, including this huge pushback of people, because some people are saying, oh, well, online worship's just an excuse not to come in person. Whereas other people are going, online worship has given me a way to come back to church that I never had before. That I can now engage with the community of faith that I could never do before because of reasons of, having commitments at home that you can't get out of, or being not in a geographical place, or not being able to feel safe inside a building. And so, the idea of being able to re-engage online has been good for them. I know that some people have said online Bible studies with young children have been a lifesaver. And they hope that Bible studies continue to be online because that's the only way they can go to Bible study now. Can you see the both sides of this line? I agree that the online church is here to stay. Certainly is here. We've already made that commitment. But I did find one article that had an interesting take on this. They said as we move into 2022, we'll find more and more information will be moving online. And more experiences, or the word that they used was actually transformation, will be moving in person. So in terms of the church, they're saying there are some things in part of the church, information-wise, that work really well online and will continue to move more online. For example, a sermon. A sermon actually works online. But there will be other parts of not only worship life, but of church life that it will be better in person. And an example that the article used was mentoring. You can do mentoring online, but mentoring in person is better. Praying for people online works. Praying with people together in person seems to add another element to that. I don't know, one person was suggesting singing doesn't work online. I think it does. But there is another element when you're together as a community and allowed to sing. Do you know what I'm saying? And so they're suggesting that as a church, we might need to be more aware of the transformational aspects of church life and be building them more and more into our in-person gatherings, and be quite comfortable that more and more that the information teaching side of things can also happen online, and not to feel bad about that. The example that they used was the difference between Spotify, probably not the best example at the moment, and a live concert. There is a place for, streaming services, music streaming services. They work really well. but it's not the same as the experience of going to a live concert. And we need to understand that difference in the life of the church and be building upon those differences. I did have another half of one, because I thought this was a good point the article made. They said things will continue to be less predictable. Yes, it's hard doing a vision planning process for 3 years in advance. It's impossible to do a vision planning process for 5 to 10 years in advance. We used to be able to do that, but because things are so unpredictable now, it's harder to do that. So we're going to need the flexibility and agility that we've done over the last 2 years. We're going to keep needing that, because these opportunities to adapt will continue to come. So can you see what I've tried to do by sharing some of these reflections? I'm trying to show that this line that we walk down, this line between having hope and having discouragement, when we see these challenges before us, we can oscillate between the two. Sometimes we might find those reflections discouraging, but other times we might go, no, there's hope in there, there's hope in that. And as Paul kept on saying, we might be feeling a little fragile, but we do have access to that all-surpassing power of God in our lives. I love the line from 2 Corinthians where Paul writes that sometimes it looks like we're wasting away. For some of us, that's a little too relevant. But that idea that even though it might be tough, God is renewing us every day. God is bringing us life. And so Paul says, don't lose heart. Don't lose heart. The best part of Kevin's story that he gave me from Exodus 15, just after, like they've just been rescued out of Egypt, they have this miracle of going through the Red Sea. They get into the desert and they start doubting and complaining and grumbling because the water is bitter. The best part of that story is the last few verses. Did you hear it in the Bible reading what happened next? Because it would have been easy for them just to give up at that point, to go, well, why did we do this? We should go back to Egypt. At least the water there tasted all right. Why did we leave Egypt to come into the desert and die of lack of thirst? Or, why? They could have given up at that point. But if you keep reading to the end of that reading, God promises to be there for them, to help them, to heal them. And then it talks about Elim. Elim is just down the road from Marah, where the water is bitter. Just down the road. And at Elim is an oasis with lots of water, lots of palm trees, and lots of place for them to rest. It's only just down the road. If they had given up in that difficult point in Marah, they would not have experienced Elim, which is only just down the road. So yes, Vision Sunday is next Sunday, and I will get excited next Sunday as well, and so will Kevin. But I encourage you today, as we consider this fine line, that we can get to choose which way we want to oscillate looking at 2022, and especially in terms of the nature of how we see God working through the church. And so I want to exhort you, if I'm allowed to use that word, exhort you to choose hope. To choose hope. Don't lose heart and choose hope. Amen.